feet above Rabaul Harbor. 26-year-old First Lieutenant James Holloway gripped the control stick of Corsair number 57. Fuel gauge read 38 minutes remaining. 11 Japanese A6M50 fighters circled above him like hawks over a wounded rabbit. His radio was dead. His wingman was burning. The flight manual said climb to safety. Jim Holloway pushed the stick forward and dove toward the ocean. This is the story of how a Kansas farmer who couldn't pass an officer's exam rewrote the rules of aerial combat, and why almost nobody knows his name. Russell County, Kansas, summer 1934. 16-year-old Jim Holloway stood in a field that used to belong to his father. The bank owned it now, had owned it since 1933 when Robert Holloway put a shotgun in his mouth rather than watch another dust storm bury his life's work. Jim had found him in the barn. The dust was so thick that day you could barely see the body. Robert Holloway left behind a widow and 2 children, Jim 16 and Sarah 12. Sarah had developed asthma the year before, chronic worsening with the dust storms. The medicine cost $2 a week, money they didn't have. Jim's mother worked as a seamstress, made $8 a month. It wasn't enough. That's why Jim took the job with Walter Morrison. 25 cents an hour operating a Stearman Model 75 biplane, spraying pesticide over crops that should have been his inheritance. The work was dangerous. Pilots died every season, but Sarah needed medicine. Every Sunday, Jim brought his wages home. His mother counted the coins. Enough for rent, enough for food, enough for Sarah's medicine? Barely. Morrison was a man who'd flown combat in France during the Great War and came home with a Distinguished Service Cross and a discharge for violating formation discipline. He'd been kicked out of the Army Air Corps in 1918 for one reason: he refused to climb when doctrine said climb. Morrison had one rule he drilled into every pilot he trained: never fight the aircraft. Work with it. The Stearman's Continental R670 radial engine produced 220 horsepower and sounded like continuous thunder. Jim sat in the open cockpit, wind screaming past at 90 miles per hour, the aircraft's wheels 12 feet above rows of wheat that stretched to the horizon. At this altitude, there was no room for hesitation. A gust of wind could slam you into the ground before your brain registered danger. Morrison stood at the field's edge, watching through binoculars, yelling instructions Jim could barely hear over the engine roar. "Read the terrain, boy." Power lines cast shadows. Jim banked hard left at the field. Boundary felt the Stearman shudder as the wingtip cleared a fence by 18 inches. The smell hit him through his goggles, aviation fuel mixed with pesticide, a sweet chemical burn that coated the nostrils and throat. Dead grasshoppers spattered the windscreen. The sun hammered down at 104 degrees. Sweat ran into his eyes. He'd been flying for Morrison 3 months. In that time, he'd logged 47 hours, all of it below 100 feet. He'd learned to read terrain through peripheral vision, to anticipate wind shifts by watching dust patterns, to turn at the field edge without stalling or clipping a wing. Most importantly, he'd learned that at 10 feet of altitude, panic killed faster than gravity. August 14th, 1937. The lesson became permanent. 2 pilots working Morrison's operation, Clarence Webb and Eddie Flynn, were spraying a section near the Kansas-Nebraska border. Both were experienced men. Webb had logged over 600 hours. Flynn had flown mail routes in Montana before the Depression killed that work. Jim was refueling his Stearman when he heard the explosion. A sound like sheet metal crumpling, then silence, then screaming that didn't last long. He ran 3/4 of a mile across stubble fields, found both aircraft crumpled like paper flames, already consuming the fabric wings. Power lines stretched above the wreckage, 240-volt transmission cables that hadn't been marked on any chart. Webb and Flynn had hit them at full speed while pulling up from a spray run. Morrison arrived 20 minutes later, stood looking at the burning wreckage, said nothing for 5 minutes, then turned to Jim. "You know what killed them?" Jim shook his head. "They climbed, saw an obstacle, and their training said, climb to safety. But at 50 feet, climbing puts you into wires you can't see. Should have pushed forward, gone under." Morrison walked away from the flames. "Air Force kicked me out in 1918 for that exact thing. I pushed down instead of pulling up during a bomber escort. Flight commander said I violated doctrine, wrote me up. I told him, doctrine assumes you have altitude to spare. At 50 feet, doctrine kills you. They discharged me for insubordination." He stopped, looked back at the smoke. 4 men in my squadron followed doctrine that day. climbed into German fire because the manual said climb to evade. All 4 died. I broke formation, went low, survived. The Air Force gave them medals and me a discharge. Jim never forgot that. By 1939, Jim had logged 317 hours, all of it below 100 feet. 0 accidents, 0 violations. He could thread a steerman between a barn and a silo with 6 feet of clearance on each side. Sarah was 15 now, still fighting asthma, still needing medicine. Jim's mother was getting older. The money was always tight. When Jim tried to enlist in 1939, he hoped military pay would help his family. He walked into the Navy recruiting office with his logbook under his arm. The recruiter was Lieutenant Commander Harrison Barnes, a man with perfectly pressed whites and an Annapolis ring he touched every 30 seconds. Barnes opened Jim's logbook, flipped through 3 pages, closed it. Agricultural aviation. Yes, sir? No formal education beyond high school. Correct, sir. The Navy needs academy men, Mr. Holloway. We need pilots with mathematics training, navigation theory, tactical education. We don't need crop duster hicks who've spent 300 hours flying over corn. Barnes slid the logbook across the desk. You're not Navy material. Jim tried the Army Air Corps in May. Different recruiter, same answer. Educational deficiency, no college degree. He tried the Marines in September. The officer looked at his application for 15 seconds. We need officers. You've got a high school diploma and a civilian pilot's license. Come back when you have something worth our time. 3 rejections in 6 months. On that same September day, Preston Walsh, son of Topeka's largest bank president, received his appointment to the Naval Academy at Annapolis. Preston had 40 hours of flight time, all of it in a Piper Cub at 3,000 feet paid for by his father. His family knew the right congressman. His last name opened doors. Jim went back to Kansas and kept flying crop dusters. The rejection burned, not because he believed he deserved special treatment, but because he knew what he'd seen. He'd watched pilots die because they followed procedures written by men who'd never flown 10 feet off the ground. When Jim tried to enlist again in 1940 and Sarah cried, it wasn't because she wanted him to go to war. You don't need to prove anything, Jim. I need to do something that matters. You keep me alive. That matters. But Jim wanted both, to matter to Sarah and to matter to the world. December 7th, 1941. Everything changed. Jim heard about Pearl Harbor on the radio while refueling his steerman between spray runs. Japanese aircraft had struck the Pacific Fleet. Casualties in the thousands. The country was at war. Morrison walked over, wiping oil from his hands. They'll take you now. Jim walked into the Marine Corps recruiting office in Topeka on December 10th, 1941, 3 days after Pearl Harbor. Different world, different standards. The recruiter, a gunnery sergeant with 3 stripes and tired eyes, looked at Jim's logbook. 317 hours, agricultural aviation. Can you fly formation? Yes. Can you navigate by compass and clock? Yes. Can you kill a man if ordered? Jim hesitated. I've never thought about it that way. The sergeant looked up. War's not Wheatfield, son. It's burning metal and dead friends. You ready for that? I'm ready to learn. The sergeant stamped the paperwork. Welcome to the Marines. Report to Pensacola Naval Air Station, January 12th. Jim signed his name, walked out into December sunlight. Pensacola Naval Air Station, Florida. February 1942. The heat in Florida was different from Kansas. Wet heat, the kind that fogged goggles within seconds and turned flight suits into sweat-soaked second skins. Jim arrived with 37 other Marine aviation cadets, most of them college boys, most of them younger than his 23 years. The instruction was rigid. Formation discipline, altitude management, navigation by dead reckoning, combat maneuvers performed at safe altitudes, meaning 5,000 feet minimum. Everything assumed you had altitude to trade for speed or position. Jim struggled with classroom theory. Aerodynamics equations felt abstract compared to the physical reality of wind on a wing. He asked questions that irritated his instructors because they challenged assumptions. So what if you jumped at low altitude? The doctrine says extend in a dive and zoom climb. But if you're already low, Cadet Holloway doctrine exists because men smarter than you died to create it. You don't question doctrine, you execute it. Clear. Yes, sir. But in the air, Jim excelled. His landings were perfect. His aerobatics were competent. His instrument flying was adequate. But his combat maneuvers felt wrong to the instructors. Too cautious, too much like a man conserving fuel over endless wheat fields. One instructor wrote in his evaluation, shows excellent aircraft control but lacks aggressive instinct required for fighter operations. Recommend reassignment to transport or patrol duty. Jim read the evaluation and said nothing. The week before graduation, Jim received a telegram. Sarah, critical stop. Pneumonia, stop, needs surgery. $200, stop, come home. Jim requested emergency leave, denied. He was 3 days from graduation. Missing would mean wash out. He flew night training missions unauthorized for pilots who'd pay him $5 each to take their slots. Dangerous. Illegal. But Sarah needed $200. He made $180 in 2 weeks, Preston Walsh found out. Reported Jim to the squadron commander. Jim was called in, faced discharge. Then Walsh did something unexpected. He lied, told the commander Jim had been flying authorized training missions with Walsh's permission. Walsh was a senior cadet, son of a banker, Annapolis-bound. His word carried weight. The commander believed him. Jim wasn't discharged. Afterward, Jim asked Walsh why. Because I saw the telegram. Your sister's dying and you were trying to save her. That takes more guts than anything we do up there. I can't let them kick you out for that. Walsh handed Jim $20. For your sister, don't pay me back. Just don't die in this war. One of us should make it home. Jim took the money. Sarah got her surgery. Survived. Jim owed Preston Walsh his sister's life. Jim graduated middle of his class, rank 17 out of 32, neither celebrated nor dismissed, good enough to advance to fighter training. They sent him to Marine Corps Air Station, Cherry Point, North Carolina, to learn the F-4U Corsair. The Corsair was a monster. 14,000 pounds of combat-loaded weight. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine produced 2,000 horsepower from 18 cylinders arranged in 2 radial rows. The propeller was 13 feet across. 6.50 caliber machine guns bristled from the wings, 2,400 rounds total. It was also dangerous. The long nose blocked forward visibility during landing. The narrow landing gear collapsed if you touched down crooked. The torque from that massive engine tried to flip you inverted on takeoff. Early models had killed more Marines in training accidents than in combat. Jim loved it immediately. The Corsair reminded him of Morrison's overloaded Stearman's temperamental machines that required constant attention and smooth hands. He learned its quirks. He flew it the way Morrison had taught him, never fighting the aircraft, always working with it. His squadron mates at Cherry Point called him the Sodbuster. Some meant it as mockery. Others said it with grudging respect. He didn't drink heavily, didn't chase thrills. He studied maintenance manuals while others played cards. In November 1943, Jim received orders to VMF 124 deploying to the South Pacific. He shipped out from San Diego in December, sailed through the Panama Canal, arrived at Espiritu Santo in early January 1944. From there, a C-47 transport flew him north to Torquena Airstrip on Bougainville, a muddy slash carved into jungle home to 2,000 Marines and a dozen barely functional Corsairs. His new squadron commander was Captain Thaddeus Garrett, age 34, a by-the-book officer and veteran of Midway who'd lost his left eye to shrapnel during the battle. Garrett valued discipline and formation integrity above all else. During Jim's first briefing, Garrett outlined the situation with clinical precision. Gentlemen, VMF 124 operates long-range escort missions to Japanese-held targets, including Rabaul Kavieng and Buka. Our job is to protect bomber formations. The odds are not in our favor. Japanese Zeros outnumber us 3-1 in most engagements. Garrett paused, looked around the room with his one good eye. American doctrine is clear. Maintain altitude advantage. Use speed and diving attacks. Never turn with a zero. These rules are written in blood, the blood of 4,200 pilots killed in the Pacific since 1941. If you follow doctrine, your survival rate improves. If you deviate, you die. Questions? Jim raised his hand. Sir, what if we're jumped from above, if we don't have the altitude advantage? Garrett's jaw tightened. Then you extend in a dive, use your speed advantage and disengage. You do not turn and fight. You do not attempt low-altitude maneuvering. You follow procedure. Clear? Yes, sir. But Jim kept thinking, kept watching, kept calculating. January 1944. The Mathematics of Death. VMF 124. Flew 6 missions. In the first 3 weeks Jim was there. He watched from the ground. During 2 of them, then flew as spare on the others. The pattern repeated with brutal consistency. Zeros held altitude, positioned themselves with the sun at their backs, dove through the Corsair formations at closing speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. 5 Corsairs went down in those 3 weeks. All 5 pilots followed doctrine, climbed for altitude, tried to extend in dives, attempted to zoom back to fighting height. 4 died when Zeros caught them in the climb engines, struggling speed, bleeding away. Jim studied the after-action reports, talked to survivors, asked questions that made Garrett increasingly irritated. Sir, in the engagement on January 15th, Lieutenant Morrison climbed to 18,000 feet after being bounced. The Zero followed him up and shot him down at 20,000. What if he'd gone low instead? He followed procedure. Yes, sir, but he's dead. Garrett stood, walked to within 6 inches of Jim's face. Lieutenant Holloway, I understand you have agricultural aviation experience, but this is war. This is the Pacific Theater. We follow the manual because the manual was written by men who survived combat. If you think you know better than 2 years of hard-won experience, you're not just wrong. You're dangerous. Jim said nothing. Garrett continued. Dismissed. And Holloway, don't bring this up again. But Jim couldn't stop thinking about it. Then came February 11th, 1944, the day before everything changed. Jim was in the ready room when Sergeant Angus MacLeod found him. Mac was the crew chief for Corsair 57, Jim's assigned aircraft. 45 years old, Scottish immigrant with grease-blackened fingernails and burn scars from 1,600-degree exhaust manifolds. Mac carried a canvas bag, set it on the table in front of Jim. Lieutenant got something for you. Jim looked inside. A leather-bound notebook, personal effects envelope, dog tags. Whose? Lieutenant Preston Walsh, VMF 214, shot down over Guadalcanal November 12th. Body recovered last week. His crew chief asked me to deliver this to you, said Walsh mentioned you before he deployed. Jim opened the notebook, recognized Preston's handwriting immediately. The banker's son who'd gotten into Annapolis while Jim got rejected, who'd saved Jim from discharge, who'd given him $20 for Sarah's surgery. Jim flipped to the last entry, November 11th, 1943, the day before Preston died. The handwriting was shaky. It was, tomorrow's mission escort to Bougainville. Intelligence says 20+ zeros. We're supposed to maintain 15,000 feet and protect the bombers. Standard doctrine. I've followed it 6 times now, lost 3 wingmen. All 3 climbed when jumped. All 3 stalled out. All 3 burned. Holloway was right about low altitude. I laughed at him in 1939, called him a crop duster hick. He tried to tell me that flying low could save your life if you knew how. I thought he was an idiot. Now I think doctrine is killing us. We climb into altitude where zeros outturn us. We follow the manual and we die. If I don't come back, someone tell Holloway he was right. Doctrine killed me. He knew better and nobody listened. The entry ended there. Jim closed the notebook. Sat in silence for 5 minutes. Mac watched him. You knew Walsh. He saved my sister's life, and mine. Doesn't matter now, both of you ended up here. Difference is, he's dead, and you're not. Maybe there's a reason for that. Jim looked at Mac. You think doctrine is wrong? Mac snorted. I think doctrine is written by men in offices who haven't flown combat in 20 years. I think pilots die following rules that don't account for reality, and I think you're smart enough to know the difference. Mac stood up. Your aircraft's ready for tomorrow's mission. Radio's giving trouble, but it'll receive. Transmit function's intermittent. I can ground it for maintenance. How long to fix? 2 days minimum. Jim shook his head. I'll fly it. Your funeral, Lieutenant. But Mac didn't walk away. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small toolkit. If you're going up in a bird with a bad radio, I'm making 1 modification. Your gun sight's calibrated for high-altitude intercepts 3,000 feet and above. I'm lowering the pipper 2 degrees. Makes it more accurate for low-level gunnery. You probably won't need it, but if you do, you'll be glad it's there. Jim understood what Mac was really saying. The crew chief had read Preston Walsh's notebook, had seen the pattern, had decided that if Jim was going to survive, he needed every advantage. Thank you, Mac. Don't thank me yet, just come back alive. That night, Jim wrote 2 letters. The first was to his mother and Sarah. He told them he loved them, told Sarah her surgery money had been worth every night, training mission, told them not to worry. The second was to Preston Walsh's parents. He wrote that their son had been right, that Preston's last words would save lives, that the debt Jim owed Preston would be repaid by teaching others what Preston had figured out too late. He sealed both letters, put them in his footlocker with instructions to mail if he didn't return. Then he tried to sleep. February 12, 1944 would begin in 7 hours. The mission briefing would outline an escort run to Rabaul Harbour, 187 nautical miles each way, maximum range expected heavy fighter opposition. Jim would fly Corsair No. 57 with a broken radio. His wingman would be Lieutenant Elliot Briggs, a 23-year-old farm boy from Illinois. By noon tomorrow, Briggs would be dead. Jim would be alone over enemy territory with 11 Japanese fighters trying to kill him, and everything he'd learned over Kansas wheat fields would be tested against the ocean's brutal physics. But none of that had happened yet. For now, Jim Holloway lay in his bunk listening to Jungle Rain hammer the tin roof, thinking about Preston Walsh's last words. Doctrine killed me. 7 hours until dawn. The briefing room at Torokina smelled of mildew, cigarette smoke and sweat that had soaked into wooden walls for 8 months. February 12, 1944, 05:45 hours. Major Vincent Sheffield stood at the front, age 38, MIT mathematics degree intelligence officer who saw war as equations that could be solved if you had enough data. He'd calculated VMF 124's survival statistics down to the decimal point, and the numbers haunted him. Gentlemen, today's target is Rabaul Harbour. 12 SBD Dauntless dive bombers will conduct the strike. 6 Corsairs provide escort. Sheffield tapped the map. Distance 187 nautical miles one way. Once we enter combat airspace, expect fuel consumption to increase 40%. Every high-G maneuver burns fuel you won't get back. This is a maximum range mission with 0 margin for error. Jim sat in the back row next to Elliot Briggs. His wingman was young, 23, fresh-faced. Briggs had flown 4 combat missions, lost 1 wingman already. Volunteered to fly with Jim because someone said the sodbuster was too careful to get you killed. Sheffield continued. Intelligence reports 30-plus zeros based at Rabaul and Tabeira airfields. Standard enemy tactic: climb high position with sun behind them, dive through our formation at closing speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. Captain Garrett stood. Tactical doctrine is unchanged. Maintain altitude. Protect the bombers. If you're bounced from above, extend in a dive. Use your speed advantage and disengage. Do not attempt turning engagements with zeros. Questions? There were none. The pilots filed out toward their aircraft. Jim walked to number 57, found Mac finishing pre-flight inspection. Fuel tanks topped 190 gallons. Guns loaded 400 rounds per gun. Radio still intermittent, you'll receive, but transmit is maybe 50-50. I'll fly it, Mac nodded. Gun sights adjusted. 2 degrees low. You get in close, it'll be accurate. Jim climbed into the cockpit, strapped in, connected oxygen hose, checked controls. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 sat silent in front of him, 18 cylinders waiting to produce 2,000 horsepower. Around him, other Corsairs were starting up, the sound built like rolling thunder. Jim hit the starter. The R2800 cranked, coughed, caught. Garrett's voice crackled over the radio. All flights check in. One by one, pilots responded. 5-7 ready. Jim's voice calm. Briggs keyed his mic. 5-8 ready. They taxied to the runway, took off into the pre-dawn grey, climbed to rendezvous with the bombers at 5,000 feet as the sun broke the horizon. Course 315 degrees north-northwest, toward Rabaul. The formations settled into cruise 180 miles per hour. 6 fighters to protect 12 bombers. If 20 Zeros attacked, the defenders would be outnumbered more than 3-1. Sheffield's voice on the radio. Intel update. Rabaul Tower reports heavy fighter activity. Estimate 30 to 40 Zeros available for intercept. Jim checked his fuel. Cruise consumption running at 110 gallons per hour. They'd been airborne 15 minutes. Fuel remaining 162 gallons. He did the mental calculation. Cruise to target would burn another 90 gallons, leave 72 for combat and return trip. Distance home 187 nautical miles. At cruise power, that needed 110 gallons. The math was brutal. They'd arrive at the target with barely enough fuel to fight for 10 minutes and still make it home. Jim's radio crackled. Receive was working. He could hear Garrett Sheffield, the other pilots, but when he keyed his transmit switch, nothing. The radio was dead for outgoing. Briggs didn't know. Nobody knew. Jim was effectively mute. The ocean passed below, endless and indifferent. Minutes stretched. 35 minutes from target. Then Sheffield's voice, tight with tension. Bandits. 12 o'clock high, Angels 22. Multiple contacts. Estimate 20+ aircraft. Jim looked up through the canopy. Saw them. Small dark specks at 22,000 feet, catching sunlight. 11A6M 50s, Nakajima, Sakai 21 engines producing 1,130 horsepower, two 20mm Type 99 cannons, two 7.7mm machine guns, combat weight 6,025 pounds, service ceiling 38,500 feet, turn time 16.2 seconds. They had every advantage. Altitude, numbers, position. Garrett's voice. All flights maintain formation. Prepare to engage. Standard defensive split on my mark. The Zeros climbed higher, 24,000 feet, 26,000 positioning themselves. Jim counted. 11 aircraft, 11 against 6. Then 11:47 a.m. The Zeros rolled inverted and dove. 11 aircraft screaming down at closing speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. Tracer fire already streaming 20mm cannon shells that looked lazy from a distance, but crossed the space between aircraft in fractions of a second. Garrett's voice cracked. Red flight break right, blue flight break left, execute. The formation shattered. Jim broke hard. Right, pulled 4 Gs, the Corsair groaned. Airspeed bled 180 knots, down to 140 in 3 seconds. A Zero flashed past so close, Jim could see the pilot's face. Young, maybe 20, eyes wide behind goggles. Then it was gone, diving past at 450 miles per hour. Briggs' voice on the radio. 5-7. You got one on your 6. Brake left. Jim couldn't respond. Keyed his transmit, nothing. Radio dead. He snap-rolled left, pulled through, reversed. The Zero followed. Jim dove, pushed the stick forward hard. The Corsair's nose dropped. Airspeed built rapidly, 200 knots, 240, 280. The altimeter unwound. 14,000 feet, 12,000, 10,000. The Zero followed. 8,000 feet. Another Zero came in from Jim's 7 o'clock. 2 on him now. Briggs' voice, desperate. 5-7, you got 2, I'm coming. Jim wanted to scream into the radio. Don't come. Stay with the formation, 6,000 feet. Jim saw it happen in peripheral vision. 3 Zeros broke off from the main attack, targeted the lone Corsair turning to help. Briggs never saw them coming. 20mm cannon shells walked up Briggs' fuselage. The Corsair's right wing root exploded. Fuel mist ignited instantly. The aircraft became a fireball at 300 miles per hour. Briggs' last transmission, 5-7. I'm Covey. Static. The burning Corsair tumbled. Jim saw the canopy blow off, saw a figure eject and fall. No parachute. The fireball hit the ocean 4,000 feet below. Orange flash, black smoke, steam rising. Elliot Briggs, 23 years old, Illinois farm boy, dead because he tried to save his wingman. Jim felt something cold settle in his chest. Not rage, not grief, only calculation. He was alone. 2 Zeros still chasing, altitude 4,000 feet, fuel 71 gallons, distance to base 187 nautical miles. Doctrine said extend, zoom, climb, disengage, run for home. Jim did the math. Zoom climb to 15,000 feet would burn 8 gallons. Running home at cruise would need 110 gallons. He only had 71. If he followed Doctrine, climbed back to altitude, he'd run out of fuel 90 miles from base and ditch in the ocean. PBY rescue range was 50 nautical miles maximum. He'd be 40 miles beyond rescue, 2,000 feet. The 2 Zeros were still following. When he bottomed out and tried to climb, they'd be waiting. Jim looked at his altimeter. 1,500 feet, looked at the ocean below. Thought about Walter Morrison, Kansas, 1937. Standing over burning wreckage. At 50 feet, climbing puts you into wires you can't see. Should have pushed forward. Preston Walsh's notebook. Doctrine killed me. 1,000 feet. Jim made a decision that violated every principle of fighter combat. He pushed the stick forward and kept diving. 800 feet, 600, 400, 200. The ocean's surface rushed up 100 feet. The two Zero pilots hesitated. American fighters didn't do this. They climbed, always climbed, 50 feet. Jim leveled off. The Corsair shuddered as it entered ground effect, the cushion of compressed air between wings and water. The air was thicker here, denser. The same principles that let crop dusters fly stable at 10 feet over wheat fields now applied over waves. He throttled back, reduced speed to 200 miles per hour. The lead Zero, diving at 350 miles per hour, overshot. The pilot pulled up violently to avoid hitting the water. The second Zero tried to follow Jim down. Got to 200 feet and the pilot's nerve broke. He pulled up hard, broke right, climbed. Jim was alone at 50 feet above the Pacific Ocean. Then he looked in his mirror and saw 9 more Zeros diving toward him. The Imperial Japanese Navy's 281st Kokutai had never encountered an American pilot who fought at wave-top altitude. The 9 Zeros spread into attacking elements, bracket the target, force him into a turn. But Jim Holloway had spent 317 hours learning to fly in an environment where standard practice got you killed. 2 Zeros came at him from 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock simultaneously. Pincer attack. Jim read the ocean's swells. 8-foot waves, 12-second period between crests wind from the northeast. The swells ran perpendicular to his course. He waited until the Zeros committed both firing, both closing. Then he rolled inverted, pulled through, and reversed course 180 degrees in 3 seconds. The maneuver was Morrison's signature move, impossible to execute safely above 100 feet. But at 50 feet, if you timed it perfect, if you read the wave pattern and reversed at the exact moment when a trough gave you the extra 10 feet of clearance, it worked. The 2 Zeros, committed to their intercept angle, flashed past each other. Their pilots had to yank back to avoid collision. Both climbed, momentarily confused. Jim dropped back to 50 feet, flew straight into the trough of a wave, using the water itself as terrain. The Zeros above him lost visual contact for 3 seconds. 3 more Zeros repositioned. Dove from 2,000 feet. Jim watched them come, waited, counted. 3, 2, 1. He chopped throttle to idle and deployed 15 degrees of flaps. The Corsair decelerated violently, 200 miles per hour to 140 in 4 seconds. The lead Zero, diving at 380 miles per hour, couldn't adjust. The pilot overshot by 300 feet, yanked back to avoid the water-pulled 5Gs, had to climb away. The second Zero broke left, the third pulled up. Jim retracted flaps, added power, turned inside the climbing Zero's arc. For the first time in this engagement, he had a firing solution. Range 280 feet. The Zero was climbing engine at full power pilot, not yet aware that Jim had reversed position. Jim's gun sight adjusted 2 degrees low. By Mac put the pipper precisely on the Zero's fuselage. He squeezed the trigger. 6.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns fired simultaneously. 3,600 rounds per minute combined, 60 rounds per second. Every 5th round was a tracer, glowing green arcs converging on the target. Jim held the trigger for 2.2 seconds. 132 rounds fired, 47 rounds hit. The effect was catastrophic. Engine oil misted, hydraulic fluid sprayed. The pilot slumped forward. The Zero rolled right 70 degrees of bank no control. It impacted the ocean at 40 miles per hour nose first and disappeared beneath white water. 3 seconds later, an orange fireball erupted as ruptured fuel tanks ignited underwater. Steam rose in a column. Jim's first kill. He felt nothing, just the cold mathematics of survival. 10 Zeros remaining. Fuel 67 gallons. The remaining Zeros circled at 1,500 feet. Their commander, Lieutenant Takeo Shibata, age 3118, kills veteran of China and the Philippines, radioed his wingmen. Lead to all aircraft. American is using ocean as terrain. He will not climb. Do not pursue below 200 feet. Maintain altitude and wait for fuel exhaustion. Shibata had seen strange things in this war, but he'd never seen a fighter pilot deliberately choose to fight at wave-top altitude for 11 consecutive minutes. The Americans' tactics made no sense. At 50 feet, one mistake meant death. Shibata did the mathematics. The American had been in combat for 11 minutes at high power. Fuel consumption at combat power in an F-4U Corsair ran approximately 2.2 gallons per minute. Standard fuel capacity was 190 gallons. Crews from Torokina to Rabaul would consume roughly 110 gallons. The American had at most 56 gallons remaining. Distance to his base, 183 nautical miles. That distance required 107 gallons. The American was already dead. His engine would quit approximately 90 miles from Torquemada. Shibata didn't need to risk more pilots. He just needed to wait. He radioed his squadron. All aircraft return to base. American will not survive. 10 Zeros turned north toward Rabaul. Jim watched them go. Didn't trust it for 30 seconds. Kept jinking, kept low, kept scanning. But they kept going. Then gone. Jim was alone. The ocean was silent except for the rumble of his R2800 engine. He checked his fuel gauge. 51 gallons. Distance to base 187 nautical miles. At cruise power fuel consumption 2.0 gallons per nautical mile. He needed 107 gallons. He had 51. The engine would quit 56 miles from Torquemada. PBY rescue range 50 nautical miles maximum. Jim would be 6 miles beyond rescue. He turned south. Course 135 degrees toward home. Stayed at 50 feet. Reduced power to absolute minimum cruise. Fuel consumption dropped to 1.9 gallons per nautical mile. Still not enough. Jim flew on. Thought about Briggs, 23 years old, had a girl back in Illinois. Briggs was going to marry her after the war. Thought about Preston Walsh. Died because he followed doctrine. Thought about Sarah, the surgery, the $20 Walsh had given him, the fuel gauge unwound. 51 gallons, 48, 43, 38 gallons. The R2800 coughed. Jim's heart rate spiked. The engine caught again. Ran smooth. But that cough was the first sign. He switched fuel tanks, leaned the mixture. The engine ran rough for 10 seconds, then smoothed out. 33 gallons, distance remaining 142 nautical miles. Another cough, longer this time. Jim climbed to 500 feet. If the engine quit, he wanted glide distance, 28 gallons. The engine ran smooth. For now, 23 gallons, distance 108 nautical miles, 18 gallons. The engine coughed again. Ran rough for 5 seconds, 14 gallons, distance 83 nautical miles, 10 gallons. The engine misfired, ran on 11 cylinders for 10 seconds. The whole airframe shook, then the 12th cylinder caught, 8 gallons, distance 78 nautical miles, 4 gallons. The engine coughed, backfired, ran on 9 cylinders, 7, distance 61 nautical miles. Jim prepared for ditching, unlocked the canopy, loosened his harness, pulled the May West inflation toggle, 2 gallons. The engine ran on 6 cylinders, 4. The propeller windmilled unpowered, then silence. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 quit, altitude 800 feet, distance to base 61 nautical miles, glide ratio 10:1, 800 feet meant 1.5 nautical miles maximum glide. Jim had 61 miles to go. The Corsair descended in eerie quiet. Only wind whistle. Jim scanned the ocean, looking for ships, for anything, and saw one. 3 miles ahead. A grey shape on the water. Long, narrow. Wake churning white. A destroyer. American. Fletcher class, USS Hazelwood, D531. Jim turned toward it. The Corsair glided silently. 700 feet, 600, 500. He circled the destroyer, waggled his wings. On Hazelwood's deck, sailors pointed. The destroyer turned into the wind. 400 feet, Jim committed, lined up 200 yards ahead. Airspeed 120 knots. Flaps down, gear up. 200 feet. He could see individual sailors now, 100 feet. The ocean's surface rushed up. Impact. The Corsair hit at 85 miles per hour. The nose dug into a wave. Water exploded over the canopy. The tail flipped up. For a moment, Jim was upside down, suspended by his harness, water pouring into the cockpit. Then the aircraft righted itself, floated, sinking. Jim released the harness, kicked the canopy open, climbed out onto the wing as the Corsair settled lower. He dove clear, swam 20 feet, pulled the toggle on his life raft. It inflated. He grabbed the side, pulled himself in. 30 seconds later, Corsair number 57 slipped beneath the waves. 3 minutes later, Hazelwood's rescue boat arrived. Strong hands pulled him aboard. "You okay, Lieutenant?" Jim nodded. Couldn't speak yet. How many zeros? Jim found his voice. 11. The sailor's eyes went wide. 11. How many you get? 1, confirmed. Where's your wingman? Jim looked at the sailor, thought about Elliot Briggs. He didn't make it. 6 hours later, a PBY Catalina flew him back to Torquemada. They arrived at 6:40 p.m. The sun was setting. Captain Garrett was waiting. His face was stone. Jim climbed out, stood at attention. Lieutenant Holloway, you've been absent from this squadron for 7 hours. Care to explain? Sir, engaged 11-0 fighters, wave top altitude, 18 minutes, splashed 1 confirmed, ditched due to fuel exhaustion, rescued by USS Hazelwood. Garrett stared. Say that again? Engaged 11... I heard you. I don't believe you. Then Major Sheffield appeared, holding film reels. Captain, we recovered Lieutenant Holloway's gun camera film. It was waterproofed. Survived the ditching. Garrett turned. Show me. They went to the intelligence tent. Sheffield threaded the film into a projector. The film was black and white, grainy, jumping with vibration, but it showed everything. 18 minutes of footage. A Corsair flying at wave-top altitude. Ocean spray visible. Zeros diving, overshooting, breaking off. The violent reversal maneuver. The throttle trap. The kill. Sheffield ran the film 3 times. Nobody spoke. Finally, Garrett turned to Jim. You flew at 50 feet for 18 minutes. Yes, sir. That's physically impossible according to the flight manual. Manual assumes you have altitude to spare, sir. I didn't. Garrett's jaw worked. You violated every protocol. You abandoned doctrine. I saved the aircraft, sir, and myself. Sheffield spoke quietly. Captain, his tactics worked. Against 11-1 odds, he survived and scored a kill. The statistical probability of that outcome, following standard doctrine, is approximately 0.003%. Garrett looked at Sheffield, at Jim, at the frozen image on the projector. Where did you learn to fly like that? Kansas, sir. Crop dusting. My instructor taught me that at low altitude, the manual doesn't apply. Garrett was silent for a long time. Finally, dismissed, Lieutenant. We'll discuss this tomorrow. Jim saluted, turned to leave. Holloway. Sir. Lieutenant Briggs. Did he? He died covering me, sir. Took fire from 3 zeros, never had a chance. Garrett nodded slowly. I'll write the letter to his family. Sir, I'd like to write it. He was my wingman. My responsibility. Very well. Jim left the tent, walked to his quarters, sat on his bunk, pulled out paper and pen. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Briggs, your son Elliot died today protecting me. His last words were, I'm covering you. And he was brave, he was skilled, and he followed the doctrine we're taught because he trusted it would keep him alive. It didn't. The doctrine failed him. I'm writing to tell you that his death will not be meaningless. I'm going to teach others what Elliot died, proving that sometimes survival requires thinking differently than we've been taught. Your son's sacrifice will save lives. I promise you that. He sealed the letter, put it in the outgoing mail. Then he lay back and tried not to see Elliot Briggs' Corsair exploding. Outside, the jungle rain hammered the tin roof. Inside, Jim Holloway lay awake and counted the dead. February 14th, 1944. 0600 hours. Jim Holloway stood outside Captain Garrett's office waiting. Through the thin plywood walls he could hear voices. Garrett's clipped tones, Major Sheffield's quieter responses. Someone else, a voice Jim didn't recognize. Higher rank. The door opened. Sheffield emerged, saw Jim, nodded once. Lieutenant Holloway, Captain wants you. Jim entered, saluted. Garrett sat behind a desk made from ammunition crates. The third man stood in the corner, a Colonel Eagles on his collar face, weathered by too many years in too many war zones. Garrett gestured. At ease, you know Colonel Porter, Air Group Commander. Porter studied Jim with eyes that had seen a lot of men die young. Lieutenant Holloway, 26 years old, agricultural aviation background, 4 months in theater, no kills until 2 days ago. Then you engage 11 Japanese fighters at wave-top altitude, survive 18 minutes, score 1 confirmed kill, and ditch 61 miles from base with 0 fuel. He paused. Are you insane, or did you actually know what you were doing? Jim met Porter's eyes. I knew what I was doing, sir. Explain. Sir, I learned to fly crop dusters in Kansas. Spent 317 hours below 100 feet. My instructor taught me that at extreme low altitude, standard procedures don't apply. At 50 feet over water, the ocean becomes terrain. Ground effect gave me stability. The Corsair's weight advantage became an asset. Porter's expression didn't change. Your wingman, Lieutenant Briggs, died trying to help you. Some might say your tactics got him killed. The words hit like a fist. So Lieutenant Briggs died following doctrine. He climbed to engage the Zeros attacking me. 3 Zeros bounced him from above while he was in a climbing turn. He stalled out at 8,000 feet. Doctrine killed him. Garrett spoke. That's insubordinate, Lieutenant. It's accurate, Captain. Porter raised a hand. Garrett went silent. Major Sheffield's analysis supports your version. Briggs was killed by 3 Zeros attacking from above while he was in a climbing turn at reduced speed. Porter walked to the map, studied it. Lieutenant, I don't give a damn about doctrine. I care about dead pilots. VMF 124 lost 8 pilots in January, 6 more in the first 2 weeks of February. That's a 28% monthly loss rate. At that rate, this squadron will be combat ineffective in 3 months. He turned back to Jim. Sheffield says your tactics could reduce loss rates by 40% if taught correctly. Captain Garrett says they'll get people killed because most pilots don't have your background. I'm inclined to agree with both of them. Porter sat on the edge of the desk. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to teach your tactics to Captain Garrett and 6 selected pilots. You have 3 weeks. If it works, we incorporate it into squadron operations. If it doesn't work, we bury the idea. Understood? Jim's heart rate spiked. Yes, sir, I can teach it. One more thing, Porter's voice hardened. Lieutenant Briggs died because he trusted you enough to break formation. You owe him and his family the truth about what happened. I already wrote them, sir. Mailed the letter yesterday. Porter's expression softened fractionally. Good. Dismissed. Jim saluted. Turned to leave. Holloway. Sir. Garrett stood, walked over, extended his hand. I was wrong about you. You're not cautious. You're careful. There's a difference. Cautious pilots freeze. Careful pilots think. Jim shook his hand. Thank you, sir. That afternoon, Garrett assembled the squadron. 23 pilots stood in the briefing room. Garrett spoke without preamble. We're implementing a new training program. Experimental, low-altitude defensive tactics. Lieutenant Holloway will be the instructor. I need 6 volunteers. This training is dangerous. You'll be flying at altitudes where one mistake kills you instantly. But if you master it, your survival rate increases by approximately 40%. He paused. I'm volunteering first. I need 5 more. Silence. Then a hand went up. Lieutenant Wesley Drummond, 24 years old, quiet, thoughtful. 9 missions survived through careful flying. I'll do it. Another hand. Lieutenant Dexter Hammond, 21, former aircraft mechanic, could feel when something was wrong with an engine before instruments showed it. Count me in. Third volunteer, Lieutenant Boyd Sterling, 25, Texas, flew with aggressive confidence but had the skills to back it up. 11 missions, 2 kills. I'm in. Fourth, Lieutenant Nathaniel Ashford, 23, Maine, son of a lobster fisherman, grew up reading Ocean Swells. Volunteering. Fifth, Lieutenant Silas Brennan, 20 years old, youngest pilot in the squadron, quiet, scared, had nearly washed out of training twice. I'll try. Garrett looked at Brennan. You sure, Lieutenant? Sir, I'm scared every time I fly. Might as well be scared doing something that might save my life. Garrett nodded. One more. The last volunteer was Lieutenant Colton Rourke, 22, overconfident, 5 missions, flew like he was trying to impress someone. I volunteer, Garrett frowned. Rourke, this isn't about showing off. Not showing off, sir. I'm tired of running from zeros. Standing and fighting at 50 feet means dying if you make one mistake. I won't make mistakes. Garrett looked at Jim. Jim kept his expression neutral. Rourke worried him, but maybe having to fly that precisely would teach him humility, or kill him. All right, 6 volunteers. Training starts tomorrow at 600. The training program began before dawn. Jim stood on the beach near Torokina. 6 pilots in flight suits. The sun hadn't risen yet. The Pacific was grey and cold-looking. Gentlemen, before we fly, you need to understand what you're attempting. Look at the ocean. They looked. What do you see? Sterling spoke. Water. Waves. Wrong. You see terrain. Those waves are 8 feet from trough to crest. They're moving at 12 miles per hour from the northeast. Period between crests is 11 seconds. At 50 feet altitude, those waves become obstacles. You fly into a trough, you gain 10 feet of clearance. You fly over a crest, you lose 10 feet. Miss that pattern once, and you're dead. Jim turned to face them. We'll start at 100 feet, spend 3 days there, then we drop to 75, then 50. Anyone can quit at any time. No shame. Garrett spoke. What's the washout rate? In crop dusting, about 60% of trainees quit. Another 20% washout due to safety violations. You're all combat pilots. My guess is 4 out of 6 succeed, but at least 1 will probably wash out. Rourke snorted. Won't be me. Jim looked at him. Lieutenant, if you think confidence will keep you alive at 50 feet, you're wrong. Physics doesn't care how confident you are. It only cares if you're precise. They flew the first training mission at 0700, 6 Corsairs. Jim demonstrated first. Dropped to 100 feet, flew straight and level for 2 minutes. Smooth, controlled. Your turn, 1 at a time. Descend to 100 feet. Fly straight for 2 minutes. Maintain altitude within plus or minus 10 feet. Garrett went first. Descended smoothly, leveled at 110 feet, held it steady. Drummond, precise, exactly 100 feet, like he was on rails. Hammond, good, little rough, but competent. Sterling, aggressive descent, but controlled. Ashford, smooth as water, natural feel for the altitude. Brennan, nervous. Descended to 100 feet, drifted to 90, overcorrected to 120, settled at 105. Marginal but acceptable. Rourke. Dove to 100 feet, like attacking a target. Leveled off. Then showing off, dropped to 70 feet without being told. Jim's voice crackled over the radio. Rourke, climb back to 100. Just seeing what it's like lower. Climb to 100 now. Rourke climbed, sullenly. After landing, Jim pulled Rourke aside. Lieutenant, this isn't a game. When I give an altitude, you fly that altitude. You freelance at low altitude, you'll kill yourself. I was fine. You were lucky. There's a difference. Rourke walked away, angry. Mac, watching from nearby, shook his head. That kid's going to crash. Day 3, 75 feet, the altitude where mistakes started having immediate consequences. They flew in a line, Jim in front, the others following. Garrett, solid. Drummond, perfect. Hammond, good. Sterling, aggressive but controlled. Ashford, reading the water like he was born to it, flew like he was hauling lobster traps, instinctive, smooth, understanding the ocean's rhythm without thinking. Brennan, scared. Altitude varying between 70 and 80 feet, but he stayed in parameters, didn't quit. Rourke, too fast. Dropped to 75 and immediately pushed speed to 220 miles per hour. Jim called him. Rourke reduced speed to 180. I'm fine at this speed. Reduce speed or climb and return to base. Silence. Then Rourke throttled back. Angry compliance. After landing, Jim found Rourke smoking behind the operations tent. Lieutenant, we need to talk. About what I'm flying the altitudes. You're flying angry. That's going to kill you. Rourke flicked his cigarette. I'm not angry. Yes, you are. You're angry because you think this should be easy. You're angry because it's harder than you expected, and that anger is making you take risks to prove something. Rourke's jaw tightened. Jim walked closer. Tomorrow we drop to 50 feet. At 50 feet, one moment of anger, one instant of distraction, and you're dead. I've seen it happen. Good pilots, confident pilots dead because they stopped paying attention for 2 seconds. He paused. Either you check your ego and fly precisely, or you quit. Because if you die during this training, they'll shut down the whole program. And then pilots like Drummond and Brennan pilots who could survive using these tactics, they'll die too. Following doctrine that doesn't work. Rourke stared at him. For a moment, Jim thought he'd quit. Then Rourke nodded. Once. Barely perceptible. I'll fly precisely. Day 8. 50 feet. The altitude where crop duster pilots earned their reputation. They didn't fly formation. Too dangerous. 1 at a time. 5-minute intervals, Jim demonstrated. Descended to 50 feet. The Corsair settled into ground effect. More stable, but also less forgiving. The ocean surface was close enough to see individual whitecaps. He flew for 10 minutes. Reading the swells, climbed back up. Your turn. 10 minutes at 50 feet. Read the water. Stay smooth. Don't panic. Garrett descended. Held 50 feet. His flying was perfect. Smooth, controlled, no wasted movement. After landing, Garrett found Jim. I understand now. Sir, why you survived. At 50 feet, there's no room for doubt. You commit completely or you die. It's clarifying. Drummond, natural, flew 50 feet like he'd been doing it his whole life. Hammond, competent, little tense, but safe. Sterling, started aggressive, then settled down, found the rhythm. Ashford, perfect. Flew like he was reading ocean swells from a lobster boat. Knew when a swell would rise, when a trough would open, when the wind would shift the surface texture. After landing, Jim asked him how he knew when to bank between the waves. Same as hauling traps, sir. You don't think about it. You feel the rhythm. The ocean's got a heartbeat if you listen. Brennan, terrified. Altitude varying between 45 and 55 feet. But he completed the 10 minutes. When he climbed out and landed, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold a coffee cup. Jim found him sitting alone. You okay, Lieutenant? Brennan looked up, eyes red. I'm scared every second I'm down there. I know. But I'm still flying it. Yes, you are, and that takes more courage than not being scared in the first place. Brennan managed a weak smile. Does it get easier? Eventually, your brain adapts. The fear becomes background noise. Rourke's turn came last. He descended to 50 feet. Smooth, controlled. For 2 minutes he flew perfectly. Then he pushed it, dropped to 40 feet. 35, 30. Jim's voice crackled urgent over the radio. Rourke, climb to 50, now. Just testing the limit. Climb to 50 or abort the exercise. Rourke climbed back to 50, flew there for 3 more minutes, then again dropped lower. This time to 25 feet. At 25 feet above the ocean, at 180 miles per hour, there was no margin. Jim watched through binoculars from 5,000 feet above, saw Rourke's Corsair skim the wave tops, saw the nose dip fractionally as Rourke glanced at his instrument panel instead of keeping his eyes outside, saw the propeller touch a wave crest. What happened next took 1.3 seconds. The propeller blades spinning at 2,700 RPM hit water. The sudden resistance created instant asymmetric drag. The engine torque snapped the Corsair into a violent right roll, 90 degrees of bank in less than 1 second. The right wingtip hit the water at 180 miles per hour. The Corsair cartwheeled, once, twice, disintegrated. Pieces of aluminum fabric metal flew in all directions, orange fireball, black smoke, debris fields spreading across 200 yards. No parachute, no life raft, no survivor. Lieutenant Colton Rourke, 22 years old, dead because he thought he could push limits that weren't negotiable. Jim circled overhead, searching, hoping, knowing it was futile. Mac's voice on the radio quiet. He's gone, Lieutenant. The other pilots had seen it, were circling at safe altitude. Brennan's voice shaky. Oh, God. Sterling. He went too low. Drummond analytical, even in shock. Propeller strike. Classic loss of control. Garrett. All aircraft return to base. They landed in silence. Garrett walked to Jim. My office. Now. Inside the plywood office, Garrett sat heavily. That's on me. I should have grounded him after the second altitude violation. No, sir, that's on me. I'm the instructor. I knew he was dangerous. I should have washed him out day 3. Why didn't you? Jim struggled with the answer. I thought he'd learn, that facing the consequences would teach him humility. I was wrong. Garrett nodded slowly. Question is, what do we do now? Sir, Colonel Porter will shut down this program. We just killed a pilot during training. Lieutenant Rourke killed himself by violating direct orders. That's different from the training being unsafe. Is it? You're teaching pilots to fly at altitudes where one mistake is fatal. Rourke made a mistake. He died. Jim met Garrett's eyes. Because the pilots who followed instructions, Drummond, Hammond, Sterling, Ashford, Brennan, they all survived. They're all better pilots now. Rourke died because he chose not to follow the rules. Garrett considered that. You really believe Drummond and the others can use these tactics in combat? Yes, sir. Drummond's ready now. The others need another week, but yes. And Brennan, he's terrified every second he's at 50 feet. Brennan's scared, but he's precise. Fear makes him careful. Rourke wasn't scared. That's why he's dead. Garrett stood, walked to the window. I have to brief Colonel Porter in 2 hours. What do I tell him? Jim thought about Elliot Briggs, about Preston Walsh, about the 8 pilots VMF 124 had lost in January following doctrine that didn't work. Tell him we lost 1 pilot to recklessness, But if we shut down this program, we'll lose dozens more to doctrine that gets them killed. Garrett turned. All right, I'll argue for continuing, but if Porter shuts us down, that's final. 2 hours later, Garrett emerged from his meeting with Colonel Porter. Porter's giving us 2 more weeks. After that, we demonstrate combat effectiveness or shut down permanently. 5 pilots total now, UME Drummond, Hammond, Sterling, Brennan. We train for 1 more week, then we fly a combat mission using these tactics. If it works, we continue. Understood, sir. And Holloway, no more mistakes. That night, Jim wrote a letter to Colton Rourke's parents. It was harder than writing to Briggs's family, because Briggs had died heroically, Rourke had died stupidly. But Jim couldn't write that, so he wrote that their son had died during advanced training, that he'd been a skilled pilot, that his loss was felt by the squadron. He sealed the letter. Knew every word was a lie, mailed it anyway. Some truths were too cruel to share. March 18th, 1944, the test mission. Target Rabaul again. Same route, same distance, same expected opposition. But this time, 4 pilots would use Jim's tactics if they were bounced. Drummond, Hammond, Sterling, Brennan, plus Jim and Garrett. The briefing was tense. Sheffield presented the intelligence. Expect 20 to 30 zeros, Garrett stood. Tactical plan is standard escort, but if we're bounced from above and can't maintain altitude advantage, designated aircraft will execute low-altitude defensive maneuvers. Holloway will lead that element. Questions? Sterling raised his hand. Rules of engagement at low altitude, Jim answered. Stay at 50 feet minimum. Read the water constantly. If you get a shot, take it, but don't chase. Your primary objective is survival. Brennan, voice shaky. What if I freeze? You won't. You've trained for this. Trust your preparation. They walked to their aircraft. Mac met Jim at Corsair 61. Fuel topped, guns loaded, radio works. She's ready. Thanks, Mac. Lieutenant, bring them all home. We can't afford to lose anyone else. They took off at 07:30, climbed to rendezvous with the bombers, formed up and headed northwest. The flight to Rabaul took 90 minutes, 23 minutes from the target, Sheffield's voice. Bandits, 12 o'clock, High Angels, 24. Count 18 aircraft, 18 zeros, 3-to-1 odds. Garrett, maintain formation. The zeros climbed higher, 26,000 feet, 28,000. Jim checked his fuel. 145 gallons, enough for combat and return if they didn't burn too much maneuvering. The zeros rolled inverted. Garrett, all flights break on my Mark 3, 2, 1, break. The formation scattered. Jim broke right with his element. Drummond, Hammond, Sterling, Brennan. 5 Corsairs in loose formation. 6 zeros targeted them. Jim keyed his mic. Low element with me. Execute on my mark. 3, 2, 1, dive. 5 Corsairs pushed over, noses down, diving for the ocean. The zeros followed. 10,000 feet, 8,000, 6,000. The ocean rushed up. 2,000 feet, 1,000. Jim's voice. Level at 50. Rid the water. Stay smooth. They leveled off. 5 Corsairs at 50 feet above the Pacific, flying in a loose line. The 6 zeros tried to follow. 2 pulled out at 200 feet. Pilot's nerve broke. 4 committed, dove to 100 feet. But at 100 feet they couldn't maneuver effectively, couldn't track targets that were jinking between wave troughs. Jim, Drummond brake left, Hammond right, Sterling straight, Brennan with me. Execute. The Corsairs split. Violent brakes. The zeros tried to follow, lost visual reference. 1 zero tried to turn with Drummond, pulled hard left, too hard. Wingtip touched a wave crest. The aircraft snapped inverted, hit the water at 280 miles per hour, disintegrated. The second zero chasing Hammond got target fixation, focused so intently on the Corsair ahead that he didn't see the rogue wave. 10-foot crest, his propeller hit it. Instant cartwheel, explosion, gone. 2 zeros down. The American pilots hadn't fired a shot. The remaining 2 zeros climbed to 2,000 feet, circled, wouldn't come back down. Jim, all aircraft maintain 50 feet, heading 135, cruise power. They flew south. The zeros followed for 10 minutes, then turned back. Jim checked on his element. Drummond status. Good, fuel's fine. I'm actually fine. Hammond, little shaky but operational. Sterling, solid, that actually worked. Brennan, silence. Brennan respond, more silence. Jim's heart rate spiked, then Brennan's voice quiet. I'm here. Sorry, I was concentrating. I'm okay. Scared, but okay. Relief flooded through Jim. Good, stay concentrated. We're not home yet. They flew the remaining 187 nautical miles at 50 feet, arrived back at Torquemada with comfortable fuel reserves. All 5 aircraft landed safely. Garrett was waiting. His element had engaged at altitude, lost 1 pilot, but the rest survived. He walked over to Jim. Report. All aircraft accounted for. 0 damage. 2 enemy fighters down, both crashed, attempting to engage us at low altitude. We didn't fire a shot. Garrett's expression was unreadable. Then he smiled. First time Jim had ever seen it. Congratulations, Lieutenant. You just proved your tactics work in combat. Colonel Porter arrived an hour later, watched the gun camera footage, saw 2 Zeros crash into the ocean trying to engage Corsairs at 50 feet. He turned to Garrett. Loss rate. 0 American casualties in the low-altitude element. 1 loss in the high-altitude element following standard doctrine. Porter nodded slowly. Effective immediately low-altitude defensive tactics are authorized for VMF 124. Captain Garrett and Lieutenant Holloway will develop a training syllabus. He looked at Jim. You just changed how the Marine Corps fights, Lieutenant. But Jim wasn't thinking about doctrine. He was thinking about 5 pilots who'd trusted him enough to dive toward the ocean when every instinct screamed to climb. That night, Jim sat alone and wrote in his journal. March 18th, 1944. Combat test successful. 5 pilots survived using low-altitude tactics. 2 enemy aircraft destroyed. 0 friendly casualties. Garrett says we changed doctrine. Maybe, or maybe we just gave pilots permission to think instead of blindly follow rules. Rourke would still be alive if he'd learned to think. But some people can't be taught. Elliot Briggs died following doctrine. Colton Rourke died ignoring it. Somewhere between blind obedience and reckless independence is the place where pilots survive. Preston Walsh figured that out too late. I hope I can teach others before more of them die. He closed the journal. Tomorrow they'd start training the next group, and the day after that another group. The war wasn't over. The dying wasn't over. But maybe fewer pilots would die following rules that didn't account for reality. The rest of 1944 blurred together. Jim flew 16 more combat missions, trained 43 pilots in low-altitude tactics, lost 2 more students to training accidents, both from pushing beyond their skill level. But 38 survived the training, and of those 38, 35 survived their combat tours, a 92% survival rate. VMF 124's overall loss rate dropped from 28% to 11% between March and August 1944. Major Sheffield documented everything, wrote reports, submitted them to Marine Corps Aviation Command. In May, Jim received orders rotating stateside. 12 months in theater, 38 missions, 7 confirmed kills, 0 aircraft lost to enemy action. Garrett, promoted to major, shook his hand. You saved a lot of lives, Holloway. Just taught them what Walter Morrison taught me, sir. Morrison would be proud. Jim flew home on a C-54 transport, arrived at San Diego in June 1944. He was assigned to Cherry Point as an instructor, spent the next year teaching low-altitude tactics to new pilots, refined the training program, reduced the washout rate, improved safety margins. He never spoke to reporters, never gave interviews. When History Channel contacted him in 1975, he declined. I did my job. Other men did more. In 1946, Jim returned to Kansas, bought the farm his father had lost in 1933, 200 acres of wheat and corn. He married a woman named Ruth Fleming Elliott Briggs's former fiancée, who'd insisted on meeting Jim after reading his letter to Briggs's parents. She'd read between the lines, understood that Jim carried guilt he'd never fully express. They had 3 children. Jim taught agricultural aviation, flew crop dusters until he was 60, trained 127 pilots over 40 years, 0 fatal accidents, an industry record that still stands. Sarah visited every summer, brought her children, grandchildren. She lived until 2001, age 79. Died of pneumonia, the same disease that had almost killed her in 1942. At her funeral, she was buried with a faded telegram from 1942 and a $20 bill Preston Walsh had given Jim for her surgery. Kansas, June 1983, 3 days before Jim died. He sat on the porch of the farmhouse, the same land his father had lost in 1933, the same fields Jim had bought back in 1946, 200 acres of wheat golden in the evening light. Ruth brought him coffee, sat beside him. They'd been married 37 years. She knew when he was thinking about the war. "You never told me the whole story, did you, about Raboul?" Jim smiled. "Told you enough? Elliot would want you to be proud of what you did. Elliot died because I couldn't save him. Elliot died so you could save others. There's a difference." Jim sipped his coffee, watched the wheat move in the wind like ocean swells. "I dream about them sometimes. Briggs, Rourke, Preston Walsh, all the ones who didn't make it home. I see their faces, and I wonder if you did enough, if any of it mattered." Ruth took his hand. "Wesley Drummond calls you every year on February 12th. Dexter Hammond sent his grandson to learn crop dusting from you. Boyd Sterling named his son James. Nathaniel Ashford went home to Maine, taught coastal patrol tactics, saved lives until he died in 1998. You taught 127 pilots over 40 years, and not one of them died. That's not luck, Jim. That's legacy." "Legacy," Jim turned the word over. "Walter Morrison said the best pilots don't get remembered. They just teach others to survive." "Then you're the best pilot I know." Jim squeezed her hand. Watched the sun set over fields he'd saved from the bank, worked with his own hands would pass to his children. 3 days later, his heart stopped in his sleep. Ruth beside him. No pain, no fear. Just the quiet end of a man who'd survived by being smarter than death and humble enough to admit he'd gotten lucky. Epilogue. 2024, a classroom at Marine Corps Air Station, Cherry Point. 23 student pilots fresh from basic flight training sit watching a projection screen. The instructor, a major with 15 years of service, cues up a video file. "Gentlemen, this footage is from February 1944. Gun camera from an F-4U Corsair engaged with 11 Japanese Zeros over Rabaul. This is the first recorded use of wave-top defensive tactics in combat." The video plays, black and white, grainy, but clear enough. A Corsair at 50 feet, ocean spray visible, Zeros, diving, overshooting, breaking off. The violent reversal maneuver, the throttle trap, the kill. 18 minutes of footage condensed to 5 minutes of highlights. The students watch in silence. The video ends. One student raises his hand. "Sir, who was the pilot?" The instructor pauses. "That information was classified until 2019. The pilot's name was Lieutenant James Holloway, Kansas farmer, crop duster pilot. Learned to fly at 16, no formal military academy training. He developed these tactics based on agricultural aviation experience." Another student. "What happened to him?" "He survived the war, trained over 300 pilots, went home, bought a farm, taught crop dusting, died in 1983, never gave an interview, never wrote a memoir, never sought recognition." The classroom is quiet. The instructor continues. "Every time you practice low-altitude defensive maneuvers, you're using tactics Holloway developed 80 years ago. He saved approximately 2,100 pilots between 1944 and 1975. A third student. "Why wasn't he more famous?" "Because he didn't want to be. He was asked once why he refused interviews. He said, 'Heroes died, I just flew.'" The instructor turns off the projector. "Lieutenant Holloway understood something most people don't. Legacy isn't about being remembered. It's about what you leave behind that helps others survive. You'll never see his name on a building, never see a statue, but every one of you will graduate having learned tactics he developed. That's legacy." Class dismissed. The students file out, talking, discussing. None of them will remember James Holloway's name in 5 years, but they'll remember the tactics. That's how knowledge survives, not through fame, through teaching. Rabaul, Japan, 2024. Takeo Shibata, age 111, sits in a small apartment overlooking the harbor, the same harbor where 80 years ago he'd commanded 11 Zeros against 1 American Corsair. An NHK documentary crew is filming. The interviewer asks about his most memorable combat. Shibata's hands shake as he lifts a teacup, but his voice is steady. "February 1944. We had 11 aircraft, the American had 1. We should have killed him in 30 seconds. Instead, he flew for 18 minutes at wave height, like a water bird we call Mizudori, skimming the surface, impossible to catch." He pauses. "I flew 340 combat missions, faced hundreds of American pilots. I remember only one. The one who taught me that the best warriors don't follow tradition, they create it." The interviewer asks, "Do you know his name?" "No, The records were lost, but I think of him often. He survived by thinking differently. That is the highest form of intelligence. Shibata sets down his teacup. Shibata sets down. In Japan, we say, the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. In war, I learned the opposite. The nail that sticks up survives, because it sees what others cannot. He looks out the window at Rabaul Harbor. Blue water. Peaceful now. I hope he lived a long life. He earned it. Russell County, Kansas, 2024. The Holloway family farm, now run by Jim's grandson Michael. A crop duster sits in the barn, not the Stearman Jim learned on, but a modern air tractor AT802, more powerful, safer, but still flown the same way, low, precise reading terrain. Michael teaches his daughter, Jim's great-granddaughter, to fly. She's 16, the same age Jim was when he started. Grandpa Jim used to say flying low is about reading shadows. What did he mean? Michael banks the air tractor over wheat fields that stretch to the horizon. He meant you can't rely on instruments at 50 feet. You have to see things before they become problems. Power lines cast shadows. Wind creates patterns in the wheat. The aircraft tells you what it needs through feel-not gauges. Did Grandpa Jim really fight in the war? He did. Never talked about it much, but sometimes when I was your age, I'd find him sitting on the porch at sunset watching the wheat move in the wind. Mum said he was remembering the ocean. Said wheat fields and ocean swells moved the same way. They fly in silence for a moment. There's a museum at Cherry Point. They have Grandpa Jim's flight jacket, gun camera footage from his missions, a display about low-altitude tactics. His name is finally on something official. Did that make him happy? He died before they put it up, but I don't think it would have mattered to him. He used to say, the best legacy is the one nobody knows you left. Michael levels off at 75 feet. The air tractor is stable, smooth, reading the air. You know what I think he meant? He meant that if you do something right, it becomes invisible. People just think that's how it's always been done. They don't know someone had to figure it out first. His daughter looks out at the wheat fields below, golden, endless. The same fields her great-great-grandfather lost. The same fields her great-grandfather brought back. I want to learn to fly at 50 feet. Like Grandpa Jim. Michael smiles. Then we start tomorrow, but we do it his way. Careful, precise, no shortcuts. No shortcuts, she repeats. Below them, the wheat moves in the wind. The shadows of power lines stretch across golden fields. The sun sets over Kansas, turning everything orange and gold. And somewhere in the movement of wheat, in the reading of shadows, in the teaching of careful hands, James Holloway's legacy continues. Not in his name, in the survival of those who learned to think differently.